Friends, how are we all doing today? And welcome to the latest in our webinars. This is a webinar 100% focused on Next.js 13 and looking at how you can use the Agility Next.js SDK to take advantage of some of the stuff in Next.js 13 and then all of the stuff in Next.js 13. And I'll get to what that actually means in a sec. So Next.js is one of the sort of the major platforms that people are using now. It's one of the things that is really emerged as a leading platform that folks are using to build websites with. Why do they do that? There's a ton of reasons, ton of advantages that Next.js brings. I think the biggest one is it's the most flexible, and I would argue the most powerful to enable you to sort of build fully featured websites that can do what you need to do and not put too much sort of overhead in there. But also, if you need to do those bigger and heavier type things, then you can put that in there. Let's look at what that actually means. So right off the top, if you go to our starters, so the agilitysms.com website under resources and starters, if you actually go in there, the first one that's listed is blog with Next.js. Okay. What I highly recommend is just kind of trying this out with a free project. Okay. So click on here, create a free account. It does a trial. Let's actually just go through that process right now. It may look a little different for me because I have 8 million accounts. So actually, let me just give me 1 second here. I'm going to go into an existing account, existing trial. So let's go to current content manager. So this is what it looks for me on a current trial that I already started, but I'm going to go and spin up a whole new one. So you can either click on start a free project, or if you already have a free project, you can go into your organization, click manage, and click on new instance. Okay, so there's a couple different ways that you can get to essentially this screen. So start a new instance from either place. Let's go ahead and in here and do this. And I'm going to do blog with Next.js right here. You can go any of the 30-day trials. You can go starter or pro. I'll choose a pro. And let's just do Next.js 13 webinar 2022-12. Okay. Call it whatever you want. Most people tend to call it test, but do something descriptive. There you go. So now you have your own instance. Let's see how easy it is to actually get this thing deployed. All right. So the reason to deploy it is twofold. One, it actually shows you what the thing looks like as a website, but also it gives you an automatic clone of our repo. All right. So let's go in, and I'm going to go to settings and sitemaps. And I click setup deployment. Lots of different choices here. You can do Vercel, Netlify. You can't really do a Gatsby deployment, so don't worry about that. Or you can do a custom deployment if you end up deploying your site manually on any web server. It could be an AWS, could be Azure. You can do that. But if you want to deploy the trial automatically on Vercel, which is arguably Vercel or Netlify, arguably two of the best platforms to deploy these automatically, then that's just awesome. So I'm going to do this first. I'm on my personal account. I'm going to create a Git repo on GitHub. So what this is going to do is clone the blog with Next.js repo that we provide. Okay. I'll do it as public Git. I don't care. Next.js 13 webinar 2022, which is awesome. I'm going to click create on that. So what that does is it clones the repo that we set up. So the repo that's in the Agility thing, in the Agility GitHub account. Then there's this add integration. So this is the Agility CMS Vercel integration. What this does is essentially sets all the environment variables for you. So that's also really cool. So you don't have to go in and do that. So I'll go ahead. It's going to complete the installation, which means it's set those environment variables. Then it's going to go ahead and deploy it. So basically I've just done deployed an entire website with only a few clicks. So that's really cool. I think I can deploy this automatically on Netlify as well. So actually, let's just close this window. You can see my Vercel app is already getting deployed, so it's almost ready to go. I'm going to click Setup Deployment again, and I'm going to deploy it. Let's just do it to Netlify as well, just for fun. Netlify deployment is slightly different, so we got to connect it to GitHub here. So go ahead and do that. And I'm going to call this webinar. So this is going to do the same thing. I'm going to call this Netlify, so I remember which one is which. December 2022. Okay. So it automatically sets your environment variables as well. So that's pretty cool. So pretty easy to do it. The only thing is the Netlify deployment doesn't automatically save your sitemap configuration back into here. So after you do a Netlify deployment, you got to wait for it to go through, and then you have to copy the URL from this site after it deploys. So we'll wait for it to deploy and we'll come back to that. So this is just like different ways to get your environment all set up and get running, Next.js 13 locally with Agility CMS. So let's just see if this is done yet. Starting up. Okay. It's going to take a second. I'm going to multitask for a second. We can see the Vercel deployment went through perfectly. So that's great. In this case, it actually redirects me back to this page here so I can see what's going on. It's kind of annoying because now I have two screens open. But if I want to just go and click on this, I should be able to actually view the site. So this is the site that we're going to be working with today. And lo and behold, it's a Next.js 13 site. Now, what we've done is we've used only the parts of Next.js 13 that are for production. So they're production ready, which is essentially everything under the pages folder. And we'll get into the code in a second. Just give me two shakes of a lamb's tail to get to see what's going on with the Netlify deployment. So, I think Vercel and Netlify both have their, pluses and minuses, but I think the biggest plus for both of them is that the DevOps is lickety split, right? You have GitHub, you basically have your code in GitHub, which we just created a clone of using the deployment process. Once we push to that main branch, automatically the code will deploy to Netlify and or Vercel, depending on what you're using. So I just think that's awesome. You can set up your own DevOps, to point to wherever you want to go. If you have like a Docker container or a Azure app service you want to deploy to, that's 100% cool too. It's probably one of the biggest things about Next.js is you can really deploy it almost anywhere you can run Node. It doesn't run exactly the same, but it's very, very close. All right. Seems like it's taking a long time to get this thing deployed here. Oh, it's published. We're good. Okay, so now I'm going to copy this URL. The URL names they give you are hilarious. I'm going to go back into Agility here and paste that in. So essentially, this now tells Agility, hey, this site has been deployed on Netlify. It doesn't really matter where it's deployed. Agility doesn't actually care. It's been deployed at this URL. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and click Save. So now I actually have two deployments, but you can see I've set the Vercel deployment up as my production and preview environment. So one of the things that Next.js works with out of the box is preview mode with Agility. So really, really useful to have that. All right. So if I actually go into this thing and make a change, well, let's just preview it without making a change first. So I'm going to go in here, I'm going to preview. So it's running my Vercel app, the exact same domain, but it's going to kick Vercel into what's called preview mode. And this starter actually has, a nice little hint screen at the top to say, hey, you're actually previewing the latest changes, which means that if I go and make changes to this, put my name in here, click save, I can either click the preview button again, or I can just go over in here and refresh it. I'm going to go and refresh this, and you can see that, one of the world Joel shows up in my preview mode, okay? And if I, add an exclamation mark, save it again, I can click preview from here, refresh, whatever. Then it's going to basically update this. And if I go back and jump back to live mode, then that's gone, okay? So that's something that is actually really hard to set up without a tool like Next.js. So a lot of frameworks are really, really kind of difficult to work with. One of the things we wanted to do with our Next.js SDK was make preview mode really, really easy. So we're going to actually jump through into some of that code to actually look at that. Let's just make sure that our deployment to Vercel is working as well. So let's go ahead, to Netlify as well. So I'm going to turn off preview mode from here. So I'm going to mark my Netlify deployment as the preview and the production. Okay, so now when I click preview, it's going to jump to my Netlify deployed site. Okay, so let's just double check that this is going to work. This is going to go to Clever Semolina, whatever that means. Launch it into preview mode, and now preview mode is working just fine. You can see I've got my preview stuff, and if I kick out of preview mode, it works. So Netlify and Vercel both work with preview mode out of the box, and the deployment process to it really, really easy. So that's awesome. Let's actually look at some of this code now just running locally and we're going to focus on, as I said, we're going to focus on the code that first that is like you could use in a production deployment. So if you are starting a brand new Next.js website, this is what I would recommend you use. But if you're just playing around, then you want to test out some stuff, then I'll have some code for you to look at after this. Okay. So if you just want to use Next.js in a production website, I highly recommend going to Next.js 13. You can get started and basically get the boilerplate from our Next.js starter. And this is what we're going to work with to start with. Okay. I'm going to actually switch instances one sec because I had this set up to an older instance and I don't remember what it was called, but I'm going to jump into it. All right. So if you look at the documentation for Next.js, it's basically tells you Next.js 13 was recently released. They have all these beta features. Everything in the beta features is in the app directory. Okay. But everything in the pages folder is ready to go. Okay. So if you look at, this is essentially the exact same source code. I may have made a few little tweaks, like changes and tweaks as I was testing stuff out, but you can see we've got a pages folder. There's no app folder in here. So this is only production features. All right. I'm going to run this thing locally. If you want to clone a repo from Vercel, there's a way to actually pull your environment variables to your .localm file. You can actually do that, which is pretty nice. So I've actually gone ahead and done this for this Vercel deployed site. It's really useful. You don't have to type all those environment variables out. That's pretty cool. Let's look at how this is put together. Typically, I'm going to zoom in a little bit here so you folks can see it. Hopefully that's a little easier to read. By the way, I'm checking the chat. So if you folks have any questions as we go, please throw that in the chat. If you're watching this as a video, because we're going to record this, and some folks, you may be checking this later. And if you want to sort of provide feedback or ask questions, easiest way to do that is to hit us up on Slack. So agilityscms.com/join-slack. That's the link. There's also links at the footer of our website, I think, to join Slack. Probably down here. Click on that, and that will actually help you join our Slack community, and then you can ask questions to either me directly or some folks on the team. So feel free to jump in with feedback and ask questions. Okay. All right. So let's work through how this is actually going to load this site and actually do its thing. So running a Next.js site locally, I'm going to use Yarn, but you can see in my scripts, I've got a dev, a build, and a start script. So I'm just going to run yarn dev. And it's going to launch a server at localhost 3000, all right, which is the same as like pretty much every React app, same thing. All right, so this is the site running locally. I've got a little extra thing because I built some edit in place stuff, but let's not look at that for now. Let's just look at how it's going to actually render content and things like that. So out of the box, what Next.js 13 and Next.js has had for a long time is the ability to, in your pages folder, to create what's called a slug. And anytime you have this square brackets on one of the pages it's in here, it will use that page for its routing, okay? But it will rely on get static paths and or get agility page props. So any page that's in here, I can use get agility page props. If it's a slug type of page, and that means that there's a kind of a list of pages that might work from, I can use get static paths to pre-render these statically as part of my build process, okay? So again, Next.js is super flexible, lots of different ways to do this, but these are the two methods, get static paths and get static props, that are they're really basic core to how Next.js works, okay? So what's gonna happen is, you can see on my index page, I'm just pointing back to the slug page, so that even if you go to the home page, here, it's actually going to render this slug page. I do have an authenticate page that is built for, I was just showing how to log into this site. Any other pages that are in your, files that are in your pages folder, you can create custom routes for those. So if you're building like an e-commerce site and you want to have like a cart page that's not in Agility, you can do that. But Agility has page management, right? So all of the pages that are on my sitemap here are going to be rendered through this slug page. Okay, so this one file renders every single Agility page based on get Agility page props. Okay, so the page comes in to be rendered, and it calls get static props, And then the Agility SDK gives us get agility page props, right? When you're doing data fetching from a standard Next.js site, from the pages folder, all of your server-side data fetching has to be from the get static props call, right? If you want to do data fetching in a component, you can only do client-side data fetching. But since we want to have good SEO for our site, we want to do all of our data fetching, and we don't want to expose any keys either. We want to do all of our data fetching on the server. So you do that in get static props. The Agility SDK gives you a way to do component level data fetching, and I'll show you how that works in a second, right? So we're going to call get agility page props, which takes basically a bunch of stuff from the context parameter that's in Next.js. So we pass in, are we in preview mode? That's how we know we're in preview mode. The params, which is essentially the path. We have our locale. So this works out of the box for multiple locales as well. So there's lots of documentation on that in Next.js, really useful. We have the default locale, and then we have this get module and global components properties that we pass in. I'm not going to talk about those just yet. We'll get to those with data loading. But we're going to essentially return this agility page props as our props. So this is going to be now available, these page props, to all of our subcomponents that we're rendering. And then we're going to do a Next.js thing for revalidate. So revalidate means that when I deploy this site and I run next build, it will basically generate static pages for all of everything that gets returned from get static paths. But every 10 seconds, if I'm running this on Vercel or Netlify or any server, then every 10 seconds it's going to check to say, hey, you know what, try to build this page again and get the updated version of it. So that means I don't have to have any webhooks that fire to update this if I deploy to a site that can actually run next start. Okay. So I'm running next dev right now. If I run, let's just stop this server. If I run next build, it's going to call get static paths, which is calling into down here. Sorry, let's expand this. It's going to call get agility page paths, which essentially outputs this as a dictionary. Okay, this sitemap, right? And tells us that all those things, oops, I need to be yarn build, pardon me. And tells Next.js to go and render all those pages statically. Okay, so that's really useful. You don't have to call get static paths. Because we have this fallback equals true, if we rendered an empty array here, then it just wouldn't pre-render any of these pages. But it's nice to have a pre-rendered pages. And then, so I could export this now. I could call yarn or Next.js export and just basically take just the static files. That's called static site deployment. That means that the site is only built when you do a build. Most people aren't running Next.js that way now. I'd say there's kind of been a switch in the last year and a half or so where most people are running what's called Next.js yarn start, right? So they're actually running it as a server. So I've deployed it. It's got all the pre-rendered pages that are there, but it'll check for updates because of my revalidate. And because I have fallback equals true, it'll check for new pages. So what does that mean? It means that this site's going to run really, really fast, okay? But then I can actually view it. I can actually get updated pages in here without having to do any webhooks or anything like that. Okay, so it's one of the most important Next.js features that kind of gets missed. So let's show you how that works. All right. So I'm running this locally, but I'm running it as if it was a live website. Okay, so it's also running on. We can actually bring up the live mode, and this is on Vercel. Okay. So for this particular site, it's also deployed to Vercel, and you can see I've got some slightly different content than if I was in preview mode. Let's switch to preview mode. I think the site's different anyway. I can't remember. Let's make sure that there's some different content. All right, so we're going to go published. All right, we're going to go ahead and we'll publish that content. I got to put an error here. I'm going to go ahead and publish this content, right? I'm not going to fire a webhook. Just promise me that you'll promise you there's no webhooks that are firing. This is going to publish, and I'll check it once this finishes publishing. Okay, it's going to take roughly like around 10 seconds for this to understand that it needs to be refreshed. And you can see I just basically refreshed this page like twice, and I got my updated published content, right? And the same thing running it locally, same deal. Because I'm running in live mode, I can get that published content now and basically simulate it actually being deployed. which is really nice. Okay, so when you deploy Next.js with agility, you get, as I said, you get preview mode, you get automatic updating if you use revalidate, and you get static site generation if you want to, or pre-rendering as I call it. And what's really awesome about deploying this on a Vercel or a Netlify is that you don't have to set up a CDN. If you do deploy to something like Azure or AWS, I recommend putting that behind another CDN. I just did a test the other day deploying to an Azure App Service. It works really, really well. We've got that deployed in our documentation. And if you put it behind something like Azure Front Door and Azure CDN, it works out of the box. It works really well. And there's lots of other deployment scenarios you can use as well for Next.js. Okay. So in terms of Next.js 13, though, what's kind of different and new are a couple sort of really special things. One is font loading. Font loading is one of those things that's been a little bit tricky to do in the right way. Next.js makes it really easy to do that with something like Google Fonts. So there's an actual Next/font/Google package, and there's like a bunch of different ones in here. And I'm using the Inter font because we were using, I think it's Tailwind. So this is how you load that Inter font for Tailwind, and I want these variables. Okay, so this sets up pulling the font from the Google font from the Next.js package. This kind of pulls apart what I want from that font. And now I'm actually going to use that inside my main tag. So this is a special file_app that loads this in, which is pretty cool. So now I've got my Inter font, and it loads with the most optimal way of running this. Okay. So that's a nice way of loading that font in. So let's just look at, if I didn't have this in there, what would my font look like? Make sure I'm running this locally. Hang on, let's go back to Yarn Dev. By the way, if you're absolutely new to Next.js and sort of React development and stuff like that, Next.js is a framework that kind of sits underneath React, but it still gives you hot reloading, and the hot reloading for Next.js 13 is wicked fast. So really, really fast to get updates. Okay, so let's run the server. You can see now I'm like, the good old default font, not very nice. But if I put this back in here, it loads the font, but it does it in a really effective way to run that font, and it's sort of fixes all of the slow font loading problems that come with that. Okay, I've also got this end progress hooked up here, so you'll see it's kind of subtle, like this progress bar along the top as I click around, which is nice to have if you ever get into a situation where you have a page that's slow to load. Then this is nice because it kind of gives you a kind of a progress. It's really nice for preview mode, because preview mode, it has to wait for the server to render the page every single time. It can take a second to do that. It gives you a bit of a progress. So that's a really nice little thing that you see on a lot of Next.js sites around there. Okay. All right. Jumping back into the slug, we wanted to talk about data loading and component level data loading. And there's two ways that we kind of handle that with the Agility Next.js SDK. One is if I have something like a header or a footer or both, right? I can have components that render those. And I basically want to do some data loading in there to render like my, any data that I need in the header, okay? And I only want to render that once. So that falls into the global components. So I'm actually going to pass in a dictionary of global components, and one of those is my site header, okay? And it's in a dictionary, so my header key has the site header component. This site header component, let's actually jump into that. So I just F12 over to that thing there. Hang on, my F12 is not working properly. Hang on. It's in components, common, site header. Here we go. All right. So you can see this is actually a strongly typed component with init, and it's going to get this global data is going to get passed to it. Okay. So Agility hooks up there's basically a bunch of components that are sort of special because we're going to pass the data in. So the data all gets fetched as part of that get Agility, and get custom initial props, or sorry, my goodness, what was the name of it again? Inside get static props, we're going to call get Agility page props. So all of that data comes back in here, and then in the layout, we actually pass that data around, and then we use that data inside wherever we need to, okay? So this actually has a global data component. We're going to pull out the header value from there because we loaded it. And then if I collapse this, here's a secret special thing that we created to solve this problem, because it's like, we didn't want to have to go ask folks to put all of your data loading stuff in here. It just makes this become really nasty. So agility is actually going to call this get custom initial props for you. It's going to pass some extra properties, and these are all strongly typed. And we are going to return from this an I header. We're going to get an I header, which is the content item that is, our header property. So back in agility in share content, we've got this site header. We want to load in, and it's very basic, but this is very common, like a logo and a site name. Of course, you can model whatever content you want in there. We're going to go and actually load that in. So we're going to call, hey, go get me this site header, bring it back. I just need that one item. If I don't have it, return null. Otherwise, I also want to go get the nested sitemap. So I'm going to load, these things are coming from the sitemap, which is here, right? So I'm going to call get sitemap nested. And I'm going to just grab the top level of links and filter out only the ones that are visible in the menu, okay? So really two basic calls. If I had like a database call or some other API, or there was other content that I needed to load here, I would do all that. This is actually going to run on the server, okay? And because it was passed as a global component in here to the get agility page props, agility will call this function. It's an async function. It's going to call it, render all this. Whatever I return from here, so you can see I'm returning this I custom data. Now agility will pass that to my site header as data that I can actually render with a React component, okay? So it's kind of like magic wiring up in the background, but what it allows is that as long as I know what I'm doing, I build this component with init, and I have this get custom initial props. Now I can actually load up the data that I need, okay? And this is the data for the header, right? So that's how you load global data. If I had a footer component, I could do the same thing there. So that's how we kind of wire up component level data loading for global components. The other thing you have in agility is modules, okay? So if you're familiar with agility, then you'll understand that every page can have modules on it. Those modules are one-to-one linked with components in my Next.js project, okay? So this is a text block with image module, okay? If I check its the actual these fields that are as part of this module, I want to be able to render those in a component, right? So agility is by default going to send you the data that's in that component, right? So I have all of my modules are in here. So all of the component modules are there. So you can see I've got my text block with image, and you can see it's of type module, and I'm going to take a module parameter, okay? Oh, thanks, Denny. Yeah, that's great. That's Jenny just put in our chat, if you're watching this video, showing how to import other Google fonts, or they're not necessarily in the Next/Google/font. So that's a great way to load that in if you want to load those fonts. Okay, so here we go back to what we were talking about. This text block with image, it's of type module, and I can strongly type this. So I basically build an interface that represents the fields that I'm going to be expecting to get from agility, okay? So I'm going to say I've got my title, content, I have tagline, my image positions on the left and the right, and we have some strongly typed properties here to make you help work with like image fields or URL fields, okay? All right, so that's the module that gets passed into there. Well, how the heck does that actually happen? How do these components sort of know when to render? You'll notice that there's no place in this project where I'm actually importing this or bringing this in, okay? It's agility that's going to load these dynamically, right? And part of that is figuring out also what page template I'm using on this, okay? So this is using the main template, page template, which is also a component, right? So literally agility with agility page management is mapping the components in a one-to-one ratio, okay? So if you're already familiar with our Next.js, this is happening the same way in Next.js 13. I've got this main template component, and inside that component is a content zone, one or more content zone components. In this case, I only have one, and I'm going to link it up to the name of the content zone, and I'm going to pass in we've got this get module. What this get module method does is it tells the agility SDK how to get the components that represent your modules, because all agility has in terms of its content is the name of that component, right? So this allows you to tell agility how to load that component in there, okay? Tells the content zone component what to do. If I look at this get module, what's happening here It's from my index. What we've got is a method here. It takes a module name. So the name is what's actually stored in Agility. There's no components or code actually stored in Agility, just the name of that module. And then what this does is it says, we've got this dictionary that maps the names to the actual components. So this is where we've imported them in from within this folder, okay? The folder structure is arbitrary. We just set it up this way in our starter to make it kind of easier for you to find things, and I recommend using that as a way of moving forward. So what this does, again, for the module name, now we've got the actual component that it's going to render with that, and this just outputs it, and it says, hey, if it doesn't exist, return null. So if you have, if you go in and create new modules in Agility without putting them in your code, this is how you determine if your build will error if that module doesn't exist yet. I'll show you what that means. Say let's just go ahead and let's take away the text block with image module, and let's go ahead and refresh over here. I get an error because it says, hey, you know what? I didn't find that React component. If I wanted to, as opposed to returning null, I could return, a no module found or no component found, not found, or something like that. If I didn't want my build to fail, okay? It's not being nice. Hang on. Function. Oh, I'm coding too fast. Hang on. Give me 1 second. Never code, and I should have done this before. Here we go. We'll return here. This should work. Being very nice to me. At any rate, I should be able to do this and have this come back. It's just for a string. Either way, you can go ahead and return whatever component you want from that. Okay, should work. Maybe not. Anyway, you could decide to return the function that you want. I don't know why this is being a poopy pants on me, but in this case, I actually do want the build to fail if I don't have my module that's there. And I think that's probably the way that most folks want to operate, so that if you have something going on, it'll just use the previously rendered version of that page. But again, you have the ability to choose what you want to do there, okay? Didn't want to get too hung up on that small detail. Okay, so we've got the ability to render components as modules, all right? So that's what happens when we have our basically this page template. How does it know to render this page template? Because you can see, just like I'm not rendering the text block with image or any of those, I'm not rendering my main template manually here either. It's Agility that's figuring out how to do that. So if you look at, we've got our layout, our main layout that is getting returned from our slug page. So the slug page, it does essentially 3 things. It calls get static props. Okay, so this is a built-in Next.js method. It calls get static paths. So this gets called every time this page renders. This gets called only on build, right? Important to remember. But then we actually return a component, and the component takes in the props that are returned from get static props. Okay, so that's kind of how this all wires up. And what we just do is in our layout component, we just take those props in and do whatever we need to with them. All right, so let's look at that layout component now. All right, the layout component's doing all kinds of stuff. This is what the props looks like if you break down what actually gets passed to you, these Agility page props. I have the page, I have my sitemap node, and a bunch of other stuff that's there. Whether you're in preview mode or you're in development mode. We also have the page template name, all right? So this, now I have my page template name, I'm gonna call get page template, which is basically this one. In my index, almost the exact same thing. If I had multiple templates, I'd put them here. And then same thing, if I somehow didn't, if somebody created a brand new page template in Agility, but didn't actually implement it here, it's going to throw an error, and you could decide if you wanted to throw return some other message, you could do that if you wanted to, okay? Question from Denis, does this help manage build completion when you unpublish content, post build, and want to rerun? Not quite. If you have, this is different from having content that's not published. If you have a page module or a page template in Agility, let's actually show you where those are listed. So if I'm in the settings section, the model section, and looking at these page modules, so it's not, these don't get published, but if they don't exist as components. So if I add, my new module here, this could exist in Agility as a name, and I could add it to a page. But if the component doesn't exist in my Next.js project, you get to decide how you want to resolve that, okay? But the default resolution for page templates or page modules that don't exist as components is to throw an error. If you wanted to not throw an error there, you could return a default component or blank or something like that. If you have content that's not published, then for instance, if you unpublish a page, it won't break a build, it just won't render that page and you'll get a 404. All right, so moving forward, now we've got the ability to basically render out those page templates as components, and then the page template has a content zone component, which comes from the Next.js SDK. That content zone is essentially going to render all of the modules that are defined as in that content zone. So for this content zone, we've got 2 text block with images, super simple, right? Let's look at inside this blog page, we've got a different component called post listing, right? We've actually got 3. We've got a heading, a featured post, and a post listing. Let's actually focus on the post listing component for now, right? So this module, it doesn't do anything except for render a list of posts. So there's no fields on here, but there is a list of posts that we need to go get, right? Because I don't want to pass all of that data down with my page every single time. I want to load only what needs to be loaded, like the first page of posts, something like that. So here we go. Let's look at post listing. So if you remember, we talked earlier about loading, doing component level data loading for global components. This is component level data loading or fetching essentially with a module. Okay. So again, we've got module with a init, similar to the component with a init, and it's going to return. We're expecting an iPost listing as the custom data that's here. We're getting this list of iPosts that's going to come in that gets pulled in. All right. Well, what method actually does that? Well, we've got this method called get custom initial props that we add onto our post listing component. Okay, and it's going to give me these arguments, which is essentially the Agility SDK, what channel I'm currently in, language code. There's a few other properties as well that I could take advantage of here. But essentially what I'm going to do is call get content list, give me my list of posts. And in this case, I'm going to go, hey, give me the first 50 posts. So I'm like, it's going to render the first page of data. You can do whatever you want. This is just sort of regular data loading stuff now. And what we do is we actually map these to a list of iPosts that are sort of trimmed down from what the full post is. So if you have a post with 10,000 words of content, we're not going to return that. We're only going to return, the date and the URL and the category. So we're not returning as much content. This is really important because it gets rendered on the server, right? So let's find this thing here. So this gets rendered on the server, but it also gets sent down as JSON, so that because it's a React app as well, right? So it actually gets kind of rendered twice. So when you return data from any of your data loading that's in Next.js that's going to be passed to a component from the client side, you want to have that as trimmed down as possible, right? So we return that list of posts, and now what Agility does is it kind of wires that up in the background to send that to you as a prop for this component. Okay, so that's why we've got the module, which I don't even need because there's no fields actually on here. But then I've got this custom data, which has my list of posts in it. So this is the list of posts that was returned from this method down here. All right. Again, it's a little bit like black box wiring it up in the background for you, but that's how we enabled component level data loading to happen without having to hard code all of my data loading into the slug of the page. If you look at a lot of example Next.js projects in any version, you're going to see all kinds of data loading in the get static props that tries to figure out every component that could possibly be on this page. Well, the cool thing about this scenario is the editor has the power of picking what components goes on what page. And that's really, really cool, right? That means that you as a developer, you just kind of build your design system, build all these components, make them ready, set them up in the model section, and then now your editors, basically you let them loose. They can create new pages, they can add new modules to pages and set all that up that way. And they can basically assemble the website from these building blocks that you've given them, okay? You don't have to predetermine how it works, right? It's gonna be more complex, I understand that. Denny, does get custom initial props wrap get initial props? Get initial props, we're not actually using that call. In this one, that's kind of an older Next.js call, but so no, it's get custom initial props is 100% just an agility thing. We basically put that together to do data loading in Next.js through the pages folder, okay? I think that's pretty much all the features I wanted to show and how they're working. I think one of the key things is understanding that this get static props gives you, whether you're in preview mode, it gives you the locale if you're doing multiple languages, and then the Agility SDK just takes that into account when it gives you your data back, okay? So that's why, whether we're hosted on Vercel or Netlify or whatever, a Next.js preview mode just works, okay? Now, there is, underneath the pages folder, also an API folder. And the example things that are here, let's get rid of that one. We don't need that file. That was me playing around. We can see we've got a preview hook here. Sorry, this is a preview endpoint. And this is actually what kicks the person into preview mode, okay? And it basically is calling response.setPreviewData. So from this serverless function, it's a Next.js function essentially, that's an API call, we validate the preview key that came from Agility, and we redirect them back to where they were, or figuring out what the dynamic page path should be, and then we call set preview data. And we only set some empty data in there. You can put, like, if you want to have more validation about whether they're in preview mode, you can put that in there. But in this case, we set preview data to anything that's not null, and we do a redirect with a 307. Okay, 307 is like the redirect for Vercel. Could use a 301 too if you want, but 307 seems to be the one that they want to use. This is from their documentation. Okay, and then to exit preview mode, essentially we're calling clear preview data. So there's no black magic that Agility is doing to do preview mode or multilingual. Okay, that's all just using standard Next.js stuff and then calling into our APIs to get the right data at the right time. So pretty cool. This is this is our base starter that we give away to everybody to use. I would recommend using it as a starting point. It's a great starting point to work from to kind of understand what's going on. This is as basically as trimmed down as it gets and has sort of the minimum stuff that you need, right? But what about the new stuff? What about the new Next.js stuff? Let's take a look at that. So if you're reading up on Next.js to do production ready stuff, use the regular docs. So nextjs.org/docs, okay? All this stuff is in here. You can also read the Agility docs. So agilitycms.com docs, right? Sometimes you may get slightly different documentation, okay? For us, there's the using the Next.js blog starter that tells about a lot of the stuff that basically I just showed you, all right? Now, one of the places where you're gonna see slightly differing documentation is optimizing images, okay? In here, if you talk about optimizing images, it's going to point you to the next image component, all right? Which basically looks like, well, it's here. That's just an example. It's essentially this image component, okay? What this is going to do by default, it does work. It works just fine by default. It's going to actually download your image that you've got from Agility, from the Agility asset library, and re-render it for you. If you use this image component. What we shipped with our SDK is an actual wrapper around next image called Agility image. So it's a wrapper around next image. I 100% recommend using this. Why? Because it means that now your whatever host is running your Next.js project, it will not actually have to do all the work of transforming those images for you. Let's take a look at an example of that. It's really important to understand how this works. So let's look at the text block with image, and let's look how that image is actually being output. Okay, we're outputting in either wrapped around a link or not. Okay, so we're using the Agility image component that's essentially saying, hey, render this image out there. Okay, so let's run yarn dev here to show you how that works. I'm going to show you with both different scenarios to see what it does. Right, the actual image that you get is pretty much the same image. So let's run this locally, localhost 3000. All right, so let's see what's happening here. So let's just go open this image in a new window, right? You can see, oops, not the thing, I want to open the image. All right, so that image is actually running through cdn.aglty.io. It's running through Agility CDN and passing you quality 60 with 768, format equals auto. So what happens is this image is going to get converted to like WebP. It's going to get resized, but it's going to be done on Agility's servers, right? Which means your server doesn't have to do anything, and a static site works just fine. Let's just change this to an image component. All right, so hang on. We need to use the image component from, I think it's, I forgot the documentation. Give me 1 second here. I think it's from Next.image. I'll use it somewhere else. Give me a second. Image from Next.image. I don't know why my autocomplete didn't do that for me, but here we go. So I'll just convert these real quick. I'm going to get to the new Next.js 13 stuff soon, I promise. But if I just use these ones, you're not going to notice much difference, especially in development mode. It's like, yeah, it works fine. I didn't notice any difference. But if I open this image in a new tab, it's rendering through my server, okay? 2 things can happen here. One is if you forget to put your site behind a CDN, or somehow your CDN isn't working, you're in deep doo-doo, because this is a really expensive server call to go, especially if you have really big images. It's doing that work on every single request in that case, right? So that's not something you necessarily want. The other thing is, if it works properly and it gets cached, now you're in an issue where this user in Agility might update this image, but you've cached it as part of the website, and there's no way to actually refresh that. And you shouldn't have to worry about that. So if you use Agility image for any Agility images, makes sense, then you're good to go. So I think by default, if you're rendering an Agility image, use the Agility image component. If you're rendering a static image from your file system, so this is something that I've actually got, as this image is actually in my assets folder under, public assets, go ahead and use the regular image component to do that. Okay, so that's the 2 rules for there. Okay, hope that makes sense. That's the last sort of like production ready Next.js feature I want to talk about. We have a few minutes left. I want to jump into the beta stuff. Okay, so Next.js, the team that builds Next.js has these beta docs. So if you go beta.nextjs.org, this is talking about everything in the app directory. So I'm going to switch repos here. I built a whole new repo, and this is available. It's available on my personal GitHub. Let's actually jump into wherever that is. GitHub. Joel Vardy. Let's look at Joel's repos. And if you look at this one, I've got Agility Next.js features. I think this is the one we want. So this one is actually a fork of the Next.js starter. I deleted the pages folder and I created the app folder. Okay, so this is what you want to look at. I'm going to paste this into here. This is the example, right? This should run from a new starter project. If you want to test the app features out, clone this repo, run it locally with an environment file. Okay, just want to make sure I didn't put anything in here that doesn't belong in here. Okay, so it looks like it's all good. Basically, if you copy and paste your environment.local file from your project that you were already running locally, you should be good to go, right? It's the exact same environment file that we're looking at, right? But everything's different now. It's like we're not in Kansas anymore, Toto. There's no more pages folder. We've got way different stuff. What they've done is they've created a bunch of special files that you create that handles all the different states that you need. We have the error state, we've got the header, we've got our layout, and it's nested, right? So there's no layout file in the slug folder, but I do have a layout file in the parent folder, so this will use it, but it won't re-render the components in the layout every time I change my slug, right? So if you've got like a nested, it really works well for if you have like really nested file systems here, but it also works really well for Agility because we have on our layout, this is just a regular layout component now, that we have like our site header and our site footer, but there's no more Agility SDK wiring it up for me, okay? Now you can do whatever data loading you want, which is really cool. So you can see this is now a server component. It's an async server component that's my layout, okay? So this is my root layout. I'm actually calling load header data. I put it right in this component. So I'm doing an async function right in the render because this is only going to get called on the server. This is a server component, right? So now I'm going to go, this is the very similar code that previously was actually in my header component in the get custom initial props thing that was like the agility workaround no longer needed. We can just load this data. I can call, hey, call into my API, the agility API, go get the site header item, go get my, anything else that I need, and it just works. Go get the, the sitemap. If I needed to make a database call, I could do that there too. Okay. Not going to get into caching and a lot of stuff right now, but essentially the data loading, you just do it however you need to. Okay. And then you've got the children for this layout, which is going to end up being the page, right? So my page for this one, I did the same sort of hack. So I didn't have to, where I'm loading the slug into the root. So this is my default page. Okay, this is like the index page, and every other page is going to render with this slug. Okay, so what's actually in my page component now? So instead of calling get static props, there's no get static props. I literally just call get my agility page, which is actually a method that I just wrote that wraps around some stuff, passes in this params. So in my lib folder that's down here, I have my get agility page, and I did put some messaging in here so I could just my own debugging because I was trying to figure all this stuff out. And essentially this is calling get agility page props. Okay. The way we access preview data is totally different. So preview data comes from Next.js headers now. So we still know if there's preview mode. So that still works. It's pretty cool. And our get module right now does nothing. Okay. So I didn't change the SDK. It's the exact same signature, but we don't need to tell the get agility page props about any modules at this point because the data loading is not done there now. Okay. So that's cool. Eventually I'll make this an optional component. I'll get the team to do that. All right, let's go back to our page component. So we're actually also calling get page template. So that's now we call the get page template based on the page template name. That gives us that page template component that we're still going to render. So this is almost the exact same stuff. Let's take out the debugging stuff. Don't need that anymore. There's a lot of like a couple hours ago, me doing trial and error on this. But essentially now we say, hey, we have the agility page template. This is a case if you if you want to allow it to be null and not throw an error, this is what you would do for a page template that was not found. Okay. Otherwise, and then what I'm going to do is take the agility data that I got from my get agility page and pass that into the agility page template component. Now it's going to do all the rendering that it needs to do, just like we did before. It's exactly the same. It's going to basically pass in, take the props, throw it in. This does need a get module because now this content zone component, exactly the same, is going to render these modules as needed. Okay. The difference is those modules, if they need to do their own data loading, they're server components. Because this is from the components folder, but because it was initiated from the app folder, it's assumed to be a server component. Okay. Right. And if you have a server component, one of the rules is that you can't do things like use state or use effect. All those sort of front end type things, they don't work. This is only basically server rendering. Okay. Let's look at the page module now for post listing. Okay. So that was the one that was doing some data loading, right? So now in the post listing, I've abstracted this away. There's no more get custom initial props or any of that stuff. We just call this get post listing, which is essentially, I have in my lib, I basically created a data loading call, just like how you'd normally set it up and call, hey, get my post listing. So get the agility SDK, go get my sitemap, go get my content list to load the first 50. It's exactly the same. Strongly typed. It's going to return all this stuff that it needs and give me my list of posts. It's all strongly typed, works great. The rendering is exactly the same. Okay. So now let's actually run this thing and make sure it works. All right, here we go. Hopefully this is all good. Tells me a bunch of stuff. Did it re-render? I already reloaded. Okay, good. We're loading it right here. All right, so you'll notice the site looks exactly the same. This is essentially the same front-end code that's happening, but it's all getting rendered on the server using through the app folder. So essentially, it's the exact same starter being rendered slightly differently. It's really cool. As I click around, you'll see that there's like a little loading. You see that really quick? There's like a little loading. it only happens, we only show it if it happens, if it takes more than half a second. So that is this component, the loading component. And this is a client component, right? So if I say use client, this means, you know what, I want to use some use effect. I don't really care about SEO on this component. And I just want to do some client-side stuff on here, okay? So it's going to deliver, when it has a client-side stuff, now I've actually sent a bunch of JavaScript down to the client, okay? So in the other server components, they didn't even have to hydrate as React components in the same way, okay? So that I actually ship less JavaScript. It's one of the reasons to do server versus client components. But in this case, I actually do want to do some client-side logic. I want to say, you know what? When this thing mounts, wait 500 milliseconds before we show the loading message, because I don't want to have the loading message flashing all the time. Let's just show you what that would have looked like, because it would have been nasty. So let's click around. So I don't want to have that. See the flashing message is like, I don't want to have that come in every single time. So let's not show it by default and then wait 500 milliseconds. If we're still loading, if this is still on the page, this loading component, then do it. So by default, it's still a little flashy, but I don't have that loading flash. Okay, so it's pretty cool. What's awesome about this is it's only re-rendering the portion of my layout that was this. So all of this stuff does not re-render all the time, okay? And that's like whether I'm running, that's in server rendering. This is cool now. So Next.js is like figuring out this is called nested routing. So it figures out that I don't need to change my header and footer every time I re-render the page. It's only going to render that once and then render everything inside of here on the server to send to me, okay? So it means that I'm delivering less JavaScript, less code down to my user as I work with this. So if you've ever worked with a React app that had nested routing, this is how Next.js is doing that same kind of thing. So we've got data loading, we've got nested routing, really cool. We've got the ability to do an error page and a not found page, so you can set all that stuff up too with these special files, right? I didn't get a ton of time to put this together. So you may have a few things that don't quite work yet. I don't have the ability to kick it into preview mode. I haven't hooked up preview mode 100%. So if you deploy this site and click preview from Agility and link to it, I don't think it'll kick you into preview mode. That will be coming next. I'll probably keep updating this. Eventually, when the app folder stuff, it is going to replace all the pages stuff. We will update our starter when it goes gold and when that's sort of ready to rock. One of the things that I'm looking for is the ability to, one of the things you'll notice is you've got like the head. So the header is actually pulled in differently from the rest of the page, the head content. And we actually have to call get agility page in each component, right? And this is something that you'll notice that it doesn't seem out of place, but it kind of does. Like, I'm only loading the page once. Why do I got to call get agility page twice? This is a thing that Next.js has told us to do. They've created a call called fetch, or they've wrapped around the default fetch call and made it so that it deduplicates those requests and only sends it once. But if I'm not calling fetch, like I'm not calling a web service here, I'm calling into an SDK, how do I make that, not have to do the work twice? And then I'll show you what I mean by that. Let's actually just refresh this page once. I'm going to get, it only called it once. Maybe it actually is working now. Well, in my other test, it was calling get agility page props twice. So unless I change something, I don't really know. Let's just watch this one more time and refresh it. So the head refreshed as well as this. Well, it only called it once. So maybe the caching is working by default. I'm not sure. That's one of the things where I wasn't able to be 100% sure about, again, caching. So we only want that call to call once. In theory, we should be good with that. There's a lot of stuff in these docs. There's different ways of doing all kinds of things. I've shown how some of those things can work. I haven't gone through everything, but definitely there's enough to get started on here. For some reason, Siri.
I didn't get that.
Yeah, thank you, Siri.
Again?
No, I don't want to talk to you right now. Okay, bye, Siri.
I don't have an answer for that.
My goodness.
Is there something else I can help with?
Oh, no. All right, I don't know what triggered Siri, but she came up. All right, so that's pretty much all I had to show about that. I hope that this was informative and showed some of the Next.js 13 stuff with specific detail with agility. There's a lot of material here. This session is being recorded. So if you're watching it on a recording, again, reach out to me via Slack at agilitycms.com/join Slack. But other than that, I hope you enjoyed it. This has been a lot of fun researching all this stuff and getting it going. Our Next.js 13 SDK is ready to roll. It's on NPM. That's the last thing to show. So we just went gold with it yesterday. Ability Next. So right here, it's on NPM. It's at 13.01, lucky 13. It actually is my lucky number. So this came out of beta. You're ready to rock with this to let it roll. If you're using an older version of Next.js, you're going to want to stay with the older Next.js SDK from Agility. This one is tied to at least Next.js 13, but I highly recommend using it for new projects. It's going to be great. And I can't wait to hear more feedback. So if there aren't any more questions in the chat, then what we're going to do is sign off, and I hope to see you all on Slack later. This is pretty exciting stuff. Really love it. Thanks, Jose. And thanks everyone else for joining, and I'll see you all on the next webinar.